cool. I'm gonna just get us going.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series. Um, it's sponsored by Journal of Popular Music Studies, the Pop Conference, and IASPM US. Typically, what we do is have presentations followed by Q&A. Today, Carl Wilson's going to be the person handling the Q&A part. And there'll be probably a little extra time for that because our speaker, Xavier Livermon, has structured this so he's going to first give a talk, but then leave plenty of space for folks to talk. Next week, we've got a double presentation on music scenes, Grace Hale, Cool Town on Athens, Georgia, launching alternative music, Johnny Dovercourt, Any Night of the Week, a DIY history of Toronto music. And so in a way, both of these weeks are going to take us into music scenes. After the first few weeks, we've been really focused on specific artists a lot. Xavier Livermon is Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at University of Texas, Austin. He's published widely in the fields of African popular culture and African queer studies in journals including GLQ and Black Music Research Journal. And the book we're talking about today, Kwaito Bodies, Remastering Space and Subjectivity in Post-Apartheid South Africa, came out on Duke Press fairly recently.
Yes, April. Like
April,
late April.
right,
It was
right,
basically kind of
right when you
May.
dreamed of it coming out. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why we're here. That is totally why we're here. So let me urge people, if you do have thoughts about questions, to use the chat function on the side to type out your questions. Carl will then let you know when it's a good moment to speak and let people know what the question is. But that's also useful because afterwards we can give Xavier the printout of what people wrote in the chat room, and sometimes there's that opportunity to get a more nuanced sense of what was on people's minds. So I think that's all the prelims I've got. And Xavier, if it's okay, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Eric and Kimberly and Carl for just kind of pulling all of this together. And of course, the folks from PopCon, IASPM, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies. It's always a privilege to be able to talk about your work and kind of share it with people and have people engage it. And I am thankful for having this opportunity and for everyone who was able to take time out of their day to join us today. So I really would love this to be a lot of questions. So what I'm going to try to do is, I think these things are about an hour. So my plan was to kind of talk for about a half hour. I'll try to keep myself strictly to that. And then hopefully, give everyone an opportunity to ask various different questions. I know that the scene that I'm speaking about, which is South African in general, but I would argue somewhat Johannesburg more specifically, or the area and regions around Johannesburg as far as where it emerged and where I did most of my research, may not be, as familiar to folks. So I know that, I wanted to give more time for questions. Just before I jump in, I just want to kind of go over a little bit the structure of what my remarks are going to be today. I'll read a little bit from the book itself, from the intro. I know that some of you may already have read that, but I know, in these busy times, not everyone has necessarily had the chance to do that. So, I wanted to just give folks a sense of the writing. And then, I want to kind of talk a little bit about what Kwaito was, talk a little bit about like how I got into it, like why I started researching it and why I was interested in it. Explain a bit the concept of remastery, which is, the kind of primary theoretical lens that I'm using to talk about the project. And then, maybe talk a bit about kind of where I see all this going, or what the sort of contemporary manifestations of this scene are at this moment. And then, if I have time, I may talk a little bit more. This may or may not be interspersed with a little bit of music. We'll see how the tech goes. I'm a little less worried about copyright, I think, than some of the folks who were focusing more on more prominent, let's say, Western based artists. I don't think anyone's going to be chasing down 90s Kwaito songs. um, but you know, you never know. So I'll just kind of see how that goes. So I'd like to start with this excerpt from my book, from the introduction, and it really is the beginning of the intro, just to kind of set the scene a little bit for what I'm trying to talk about. So Yeovil is a neighborhood that sings to the heart. From the moment of my first sojourn in Johannesburg, I found myself drawn to the neighborhood's vibrant, resonant streets. Beyond the front door of my student guest house, right off of Raleigh and Rocky Street, I began to explore the neighborhood with gusto. I found the city so cosmopolitan, so alive. The Congolese barbers who gave the best haircuts, one I wish I could have right now. um, the cafe that served the fluffiest pastry, the bar with the best and cheapest drinks, the clubs with the most eclectic mixes. So much seemed possible at night in Yeovil, and I wanted to be a part of that possibility. More than 20 years later, those nighttime memories bring a sly smile to my face. I remember hearing the 1996 Scheme hit Va Va Je, which translates to Where Were You, for the first time in a taxi from Johannesburg's main train station as I made my way back from Maseru to Yeovil. The unmistakable thumping of the music, that familiar four on the floor house signature, the electric keyboard melody, and the voice of Ishmael, the region's ruling new voice in the heady, rhythm-driven soundscape that is Kwaito dance music soaring. Ishmael seemed to be taunting us listeners with his question, where were you? Va va je, where were you? Onolekai, bo kupi. Songs like Scheme's breakthrough hit provide resounding demonstrations of Kwaito's play with various sound traditions. In this case, the pop and bubblegum era of 1980s township disco, to root itself in the long genealogy of South African music. Now, Scheme and early Kwaito itself, particularly songs like Va Va Je, are undoubtedly considered part of those traditions. Listening to the song in our present moment reveals how music shifts and establishes new orders of time. The song, produced in the 90s, implored its listeners to remember where they stood in the 80s. Today, it has become self-referential. Where were you when you first heard this song? It has become an index for the very question it asks its listeners to consider over and again in its 4-minute window of time. Yeovil by Night is an analytical entrance into the kinds of possibilities I witnessed in the bodies of Black post-apartheid youth when approached through Kwaito as a time-folding cultural form. These performance practices, set in time to Kwaito's beats, are critical to this study. A night out in the Yeovil of the 1990s was absolutely an ephemeral experience, the conditions for which will not be duplicated again. Dressed and ready to see what the night had in store, I did what many young Black South Africans living in the newly integrating inner city of Johannesburg did at that time. My crew of young cosmopolitans and I wandered from club to club, absorbed the vibrancy of the streets among other young Black people who may have lived in the townships, or may have been university students, or may have been young professionals seeking new thrills in an otherwise familiar landscape of urban nightlife. We were all looking for opportunities to perform new freedoms. If any one spot in the social landscape was representative of this early burgeoning Black youth culture and its pulsing nightlife, it was House of Tandoor. Located in the heart of Yeovil, this 2-story night spot was the place to see and be seen. It was decorated in what can only be described as Rastafarian Afro-Bohemian chic, a prominent red, yellow, green paint palette complemented by various portraits of Bob Marley covering the walls. Downstairs, Kwaito roared from the speakers, and the appreciative crowd swayed, grinded, and pulsed to the latest and a few classic Kwaito hits. But the fun of House of Tandoor was always in the blend of the upstairs and downstairs parties. Upstairs was an open patio, rooftop-like deck where one could watch the crowds on Rocky Street stream by while dancing to the latest dancehall, hip-hop, and R&B hits. While radio may have been the first medium for the latest sounds that would make up the melange of post-apartheid Black urban culture. Night spots like Tandor were often spots to perform and experience these songs. The mix of people roaming from place to place in the area ensured a particular kind of openness to the new, the different, and the experimental. I remember the shock and thrill of seeing openly queer African men and women occupying public space on Rocky Street, a site that seemed somehow open to performances of of queer sexuality without being marked as queer space. As I explored my own budding sexuality, enjoying the prospect of flirtatious eye contact and lingering stares, releasing into a hand placed flirtatiously on my shoulder or arms gripped tight around my waist as a new partner and I danced in unison, I embraced a sense of possibility that seemed unimaginable in the places I had left behind. This book considers how Kwaito artists and their performances, fans, representations, all illuminate variegated discourses and paradigms of freedom for Black South Africans in the post-apartheid world. So I read that excerpt because I wanted folks to get a sense of a couple of different things, one of which is kind of the kind of performance ethnography that I was engaged in from a methodological perspective to do the work. This idea that at some point I became a part of the very thing that I was critiquing and analyzing, right? So I wasn't just observing it, I wasn't just being in it, but I really actually was a part of the very thing. And so trying to think about my own performing body, right, as a sort of ethnographic practice that illuminated the things that I was seeing around me. But it also touches on these questions of freedom that were so central to our understandings of what was going to happen now that apartheid was formally over, and that you had a majority Black government in South Africa. And so that excerpt to me spoke to those kinds of freedoms that people were trying to personally explore. It was also about shifts in geographic space, right? As more and more Black youth moved into these areas that they had been formerly excluded from. And so I would like to just play a little bit of the Vava song. Oh, what happened? I'd like to play a little bit of the Vava J song, just so that we can see. So I'm gonna hope that this works. And I'm just playing audio file. Okay, great. Right. Sorry, I didn't know I needed to have a password. Okay, I don't actually know what this password is. Let me see.
We were hearing it just now.
Oh, you were? Okay, no problem then. We'll just keep going. Sorry, I thought folks weren't hearing it. Thank you. I'll keep going. Weekend special at the Busa no de guy. Pen out at the Tukisa no de guy. We must have many at the Busa no de guy. I'ma take the Asashes no de guy. See I'm a soldier no cheap no de guy. No de guy, 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 no de guy. So what I hope that you were able to hear in that was just actually just a little bit of a sense of Kwaito's rhythms, but thinking about, so there are two things I wanted to kind of point out about that song. Okay. I wanted to think a little bit about a couple of different things that kind of get animated in that track. One is that you can really hear the kind of way that Kwaito articulates to kind of global house sounds, and particularly the sort of genealogy with Chicago style house, with that would have been circulating around that time. In addition to that, you have also just the lyrics itself, right, where he's sort of repeating in the different languages, which I think was an important kind of way of performing a certain kind of South African nationalism in the immediate post-apartheid period, right? So you get the song in Afrikaans, English, Sotho, and Zulu. And then as you're listening to the background of the music, he's just kind of going over this sort of litany of hits, right, from the 1980s that were really big and popular in sort of what the genre of South African township disco. And so it's weird because at that time you were thinking about it as like, where was I when these songs out were in the 80s? Or were in the 80s. And now, you know, listening to it now, it kind of creates that jumble of like the past, the present, and the future. So
everybody stinks of shit.
So in the process of that, it just
everybody stinks of shit.
Is she just gonna keep doing this?
Everybody stinks of shit.
We've not had this problem before. It seems to be coming from Luisa Vasconcelos. Does anyone know her?
I don't know her. I'll do a Mariah Carey. I don't know her. You know.
Oh God. Does anyone have any advice on what I need to do?
You can't mute her as the host.
Yeah, I thought you could mute her.
Okay, let me try.
Or kick her off.
Yeah, I think you might have to remove her.
Okay, sorry, this is our first time having this happen.
Yeah, never heard of this.
I feel special, you know.
I'm going to remove Luisa Vasconcelos. Okay, that has been done. Sorry, everybody.
Okay. So, as I was saying, you know, there's a time shifting that's happening here in the song itself, both as we sort of remember, right, the song itself as a sort of nostalgic practice that then sort of projects both back into the future and into the past. And so one of the things I wanted to do before just kind of going through for folks who just might not be as familiar with the form is to kind of define Kwaito. And as I said that, you know, it's generally accepted as sort of a form of global house music. And I normally tell people, you know, imagine a mix of kind of Afro pop, a lot of that which was kind of built off of the sort of synth pop of 80s township disco, you know, mixed with a little dancehall, R&B, and Chicago style house, and you kind of have Kwaito, right, performed in the sort of urban vernaculars of South Africa. And so to that extent, a lot of the music rhythmically, it is distinguished by being a bit slowed down or slower. Although I think at different times as the genre and scene have developed, it, you know, it has sped up a little bit. It's gone back slower again, right? But particularly its 90s iteration was a kind of really kind of slowed down version of any, you know, sort of the electronic dance music or house music. And so one of the things that and so that's just kind of by way of just being able to kind of provide a sense of how the music is being made. So we're talking kind of, you know, using computers and different, you know, studio equipment and stuff like that. Not really a lot of live instrumentation, although there were some particular artists that did go into live instrumentation, but generally people would perform with backing tracks. And that was really important because a lot of that meant that there had to be a particular kind of attention to the sartorial and to dancing and to these other elements, right? Because, you know, there wasn't a band that was kind of grooving in the background, you know, playing for people. So I just want to talk a little bit about why Kwaito in this particular sense, or like why I got into it, how I got into it. And I remember being on a plane to Johannesburg. I was on my way there for an entirely unrelated purpose. And one of the last things that was played was It's About Time by Boom Shaka, which was kind of like a classic Kwaito hit. And one of the things that, and I just listened to that and I'm like, what is this, right? Like, what is this thing? Like, what is this music? It feels like this just really completely complex blend of all these sort of Afro-diasporic styles coming together. I was like, wait, there's a raga chant going on. And then I hear some house, and then I hear clearly an R&B sample. And I just was really, interested in knowing more about it. I literally got off the plane, and I think there was a record shop in the airport, and I bought the cassette. These were cassette times. I bought the cassette for Boom Shaka at that point. And then I just moved forward from there, collecting a lot of Kwaito and just becoming a bit of a consumer of it, and learned, like, every new artist, getting their tapes, and kind of creating this really extensive collection. And one of the things that struck me about Kwaito was the way that it was being discussed in the press. And it reminded me so much of what I felt were certain kinds of unnuanced or not particularly specific takes that I had read about hip hop, growing up as well, right? And I just began to think it's really interesting to me that when young Black folks kind of are creating something new, there seems to be a similar set of criticism that gets mobilized. And I saw that as well here. There was a lot of kind of discussion of that kind of went to dismissing, the cultural form, went to dismissing its sort of political and social impact. And I remember thinking about the way that it was being talked about. There were always conversations around the display of material culture, right? So that consumption was always looked at as something that was in and of itself negative, and also sort of represented some kind of crisis of young people, some sort of fall of young people, some sort of turning away from, I guess, a previous, more politically engaged form of popular culture and music. There were also very binaristic takes, I felt, on gender and sexuality. I wasn't seeing the kinds of queer and feminist possibilities within the music that I and my friends were experiencing being represented in a lot of the commentary that was being proffered. And I also felt that there was not a sense of thinking about the ways that Black South African youth were trying to engage global Black culture, right? And so I began to think about this through a sort of Afro-diasporic lens in order to, I think, sort of counter this idea that this was a sort of unfortunate, an unfortunate globalization, right? An unfortunate sort of capitulation to a sort of undifferentiated mass global culture. And, as journalistic takes and scholarly takes continue to sort of, emerge in the late 90s and early aughts, I did feel that maybe I had something to say. So, it wasn't originally like my dissertation project. It was just music I liked. I danced to it, I collected it. It was in many ways the soundtrack of that part of my life because I was living in South Africa, in Southern Africa at that time. But at some point I said, I feel like there's something that I could potentially add to this conversation. And it allowed me to be able to talk about what I felt was the imbrication of the global and local that's going on with Kwaito, and kind of shooting that through or rooting that through an Afro-diasporic lens, to think about the ways that women and queer folks show up or don't show up in the music and the culture. And to also consider, I think, in different ways, the role of consumption in popular music, and particularly amongst people who are sort of framed as, not being able to afford, right, certain kinds of commercial goods, And therefore there seemed to always be an underlying critique that, you know, they shouldn't have it or they don't deserve it, right? And also there was this idea of how young people were playing with the past and using the past and reanimating the past. And so each of the chapters of the book kind of get into some aspects of that. So either dealing with consumption, dealing with gender and sexuality, or dealing with what I would call a somewhat irreverence for the past that happens in the music. And so part of what I tried to sit at were the multiple contradictions, right? So I don't want to, you know, I don't want to make it seem as if there weren't some kind of truth to some of these critiques around questions of consumption, around, you know, ideas of how gender was being engaged or not engaged, et cetera. But I wanted to kind of sit in those contradictions and work through those contradictions in somewhat, I felt like, less binaristic and totalizing ways. And so in order to kind of chart that, I came up with this concept of remastery. And I have to give a shout out to my colleague at UT, Lyndon Gill, who kind of helped me come up with that idea. I wanted something that could potentially be a bit of a musical term, but could also refer to certain kinds of historical and continued racial dynamics that might be going on. And I kept going back and forth, and he just suggested, well, what about remastery? And I thought, wow, that feels like something that can kind of do this work metaphorically in this project. Because I wanted to get at that thing that, you know, wasn't this complete break, right? You know, and for a lot of us who do post-colonial studies, of course, we're always talking about how the post doesn't necessarily represent a clean break, right? But it kind of speaks to the residues of that thing that came before. So remastery, I think, allowed me to do a little bit of that, and to kind of think about, you know, naming a kind of shift that wasn't perhaps a complete, you know, revolution or, you know, overturn of what previously existed, but that something had shifted, right? You know, something had been kind of cleaned up and made a little bit more, you know, pure and fine and easier to listen to, right, or more clear in its sort of sound, right? And so the question for me, when I thought about that, and I haven't had an opportunity to do a lot of presentations on the book up till now, but one of the questions that I was asked in one of the talks I gave earlier was, well, why not a decolonial lens, right? Instead of this question of remastery. And I thought about that and I said, well, one, it's partially because I don't think that would actually be an accurate description of what young people were thinking, right? And what the sort of scene was putting out. But secondly, I think that there was this sense at the time that these things could be, you know, for lack of a better word, remastered, right? That Black people taking over the government would mean something significant in the way that the government related to its Black citizens. That Black people engaging in educational institutions would mean something significantly different. And so I think people came in with this idea that you know, that their arrival, right, would I think inaugurate the system of change that needed to happen. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that so many of these early Kwaito artists are about the announcing arrival, right? There's a lot of singi kona, right? I'm here, right? You know, a lot of trying to kind of claim and appropriate and engage and access spaces of exclusion. Or spaces of former exclusion, although we could say that in many ways those exclusions still continue. And so that was what I really was trying to get at with the term remastery. It was meant to kind of think about that cleaning up process, that process of kind of, you know, eliminating the kind of sound imperfections, right? But you're not necessarily doing a completely new recording, right? And then it was also meant to kind of refer to frameworks of the colonial, right? And this idea of a sort of master servant, master slave, colonizer, colonized relationship that was trying to be reimagined by young people at that time. And that oftentimes was, I think, about a kind of working within and through existing structures. And so I think I found it to be an apt metaphor for thinking about both the kind of, to think about the sort of social implications of what was going on at the time. But I also recognize that, there were people at that time who were calling for a different kind of, framework, right? And who did not feel particularly satisfied with the negotiations that happened between 1990 and 94 and what came out of that. And so I don't want to just dismiss that and be like, yay, remastery, as if there wasn't, a kind of Black radical position that was resistant to that in certain kinds of ways, both, politically, but also in, artistic and sonic spaces. But I also want to just think about, I think the fact that a lot of people were, I think, working with this sort of idea that these political changes were the decolonial moment, right? And I think that what we've discovered, as South Africa has moved, is that that's not necessarily the case, right? And I think that you're seeing contemporary cultural practices both anticipate that, try to move toward, I think, something else, right? But I think that this idea of remastery and a lot of the practices that came out of Kwaito were oftentimes, I think, a template, right, for what we're seeing now in contemporary youth culture. And many people will ask me, does Kwaito still exist? Like, is there still actual Kwaito, being made? And I'll say yes, I just think it's being called and marketed as something else. I think that, some of the more contemporary comb music, ama piano, and even some of the South African house and hip hop really are tracing on the legacies of Kwaito music and culture. And certainly I think for trying to take a stand, occupy space, and I think kind of announce confidently a sense of, we're here, you're gonna have to deal with us as young Black people in this society. It provided, I think, a template for those conversations. I think, let me see, how am I doing on time? So I'm going a little over. I wanted to kind of just close with one final music snippet, which is, let me see if I can share my screen, which is from Boom Shaka saying "It's About Time." So let me just go back to my share. Sorry, guys.
Is it not working?
Is it not?
I had switched it when we had that Zoom bomber. Oh, here we go. Okay, good.
Okay. Is it fine? Okay. Sorry.
I'm tired of people always asking me what's happening, what's going on. They try to see what's in my head. Why can't they leave me alone? Yeah. It's about time you listen to Shaka. It's about time you listen to Boom. It's about time you listen to Boom Shaka. It's about time.
So, this idea that Black youth in South Africa had something to say that needed to be engaged, needed to be listened to, and needed to be taken seriously was really at the hallmark of the scene. And I think it provided a lens for thinking about what young Black people were interested in freedom, and I think tested a lot of, you know, these sort of understandings of that oftentimes were inherited from the liberation movement around, you know, young people as sort of passive recipients of state beneficence and aid rather than kind of active, you know, sort of participants in what the future might mean. You know, these ideas around gender propriety, how are women supposed to dress, how are they supposed to present their sexuality, these ideas around queer bodies, all of these things were tested in various different ways by Kwaito. And in testing those things, I think there was this sort of constant negotiation about what in fact did this new political dispensation mean. And to the extent that Kwaito itself was a lightning rod for, I think, a lot of various different forms of dismissal and criticism, it spoke to, I think, in many ways, the need to actually go back and think about, well, what is this you know, social and cultural freedom that's trying to be created? So I think, and I think unfortunately, well, fortunately, unfortunately, but I think that that's honestly the ongoing question from both a sort of social, a political, a cultural realm in South Africa right now, as far as, you know, who actually, you know, what kinds of practices bubble to the surface when they emerge in that scene, who actually is making the money off of them, and so on and so forth, right? And Boom Shaka really was one of the first groups to take a bit more control and ownership of their masters, by the way, to get back to that, and negotiate kind of a better deal, because they were so popular at that time in the mid 90s, and mainstream record companies that had been operating in South Africa were completely unprepared for Kwaito. You know, they just didn't even know what to do with it. And so they were always kind of in the mid to late 90s kind of playing catch up. And I think that allowed Boom Shaka to be able to kind of negotiate a far more control and better deal than a lot of Black musicians who were in more established genres had been able to do. So I think with that, I will close. I know I went a little over, but I look forward to hearing your questions and being able to dialogue a bit.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? So yeah, we'll go to Q&A. We've only got a couple of questions in the chat so far. So as we go, if anybody else wants to put their names in there, and then I'll call on you. First, I'm going to call on, and excuse me if I mispronounce anybody's name, on Marzia, who had questions about Kwaito and house. And you guys can just unmute yourselves and speak up when that happens. If she's still there.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this event. I'm really excited to be here. So you already answered one of my questions, which is about the relationship between Kwaito and contemporary house music, right? So basically what you suggest is that there is a lot of continuity between Kom and Amapiano and house music, if I understood it correctly. So basically, when Big Nas and DJ Tira and Umlilo in 2010 said that Kwaito is dead, they were mistaken, right? And so I was wondering if you could speak more about that relationship between Kwaito and house music. Because there seems to still be an investment in thinking of Kwaito as separate from especially mainstream house music such as today, right? So is it a subset of house music? Is it something different? And also, I really loved how your book refutes these simplistic arguments that postulate that Kwaito was or is apolitical or simply consumerist, and how you brilliantly navigate beyond these binaries of political, apolitical, resistant, and not resistant. And house is also often accused of the same thing, right? Being apolitical. But it's also a very important force for self-expression for Black youth and adults alike. So I was wondering, can we use some of the theoretical tenets that you propose to read Kwaito, also to read, Amapiano today, to read some of the more contemporary musics that is coming out of South Africa. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for such a detailed question. I really appreciate being able to get into that. I mean, I definitely, look, I think that you'll find many people, both musicians and cultural commentators, who are basically like, Kwaito's done. And I understand the reason, particularly for like when a lot of those Durban cats basically kind of got into the scene. There was a way that they were marginalized from the traditional Kwaito scene. But there was also a way in which, if you look at something like Gqom, right, it is drawing so much from certain kinds of traditional Zulu musics, right? And there's some evidence that even Amapiano is doing the same, right? So while they are, of course, articulated to these global house music trends, right, there's a kernel there that's kind of really drawing from some of these traditional Zulu musics, particularly with Gqom. I've done less work on Amapiano, so I won't speak as authoritatively about that. But definitely with like really old school originary, Gqom, it was drawing quite a bit from some of those, Zulu sounds, basically. In way, like as it's a base rather than maybe layered over, which you might get in a house, or you might get even in some Kwaito music back in the late 90s or early aughts. And so I think that I say that because I think that might possibly contribute to the need to kind of define yourself apart. But I'm also not going to ever, and I'm sure you're aware of the Born to Kwaito book by Esinako Dabeni, and so I think that they have this really interesting take, because part of what they talk about is that even for people who lived through that generation, comes in and comes out, at different moments, during that time, and then has different kinds of influences. I mean, I would argue a lot of folks who were lauded for doing hip hop were incorporating a ton of Kwaito, at least sonically, into their work. And I think that in the early to mid 10s, you definitely had a lot of people going back, like, so I'm thinking about and I cannot remember his name now, but the guy who sampled Mdu Siki Siki. I mean, that was one of the best hip hop songs, in my opinion, but I don't know if people really thought it was real. Oh, his name was Duncan, Zulu rapper, who, samples Mdu, Siki Siki, right? And so, I think it's interesting now. I think Kwaito has become this thing that can be sampled by hip hop, or that can be the basis for, thinking about all of these different genres. And of course, my favorite kind of not really existent genre anymore, and I don't know, Marzia, how familiar you are with this, but Pretoria House was just the thing, in the mid-aughts, and got all kinds of worldwide attention, was like in Fader, people were being flown to the UK to do sets. And yeah, all of that, it just kind of came and went, right? And it was kind of doing something that was also, I think, in conversation. So to me, I find that Kwaito ultimately is a part of this larger global house movement, right? But of course, within the South African sphere itself, these distinctions become really, really, really critical and important, right? And the scenes kind of get defined, and some of it is class and some of it's location, as far as like who's doing it, or who, who has access to it, and so forth. So I think that's kind of what I would say. But I think the distinctions are interesting. But I mean, one of the things I'm seeing now is with this nostalgia, you know, for old school Kwaito coming back, I think you will have this sort of old school thing happening. But I think there's also going to be, you know, younger people who are gonna, you know, who are kind of calling themselves contemporary Kwaito artists, right? They want to kind of do something with the form and bring it up. So thank you so much for your questions, and thank you for engaging the book. I appreciate it.
So the other person we had a question from in the now dead chat room was David Grubbs asking about Kwaito across borders. So maybe David could take over.
Sure. With the introduction, I thought that one of the real strengths of it was situating the emergence of Kwaito in post-apartheid South Africa, and yet this phrase that you quote from Kagura Macharia about political vernaculars untethered to state imaginaries made me. It was something that was introduced, and yet it felt kind of against the grain of the rest of the introduction. So, but maybe this is just that I haven't read beyond the introduction. But so I'm curious to know about not only the reception, but you know the significations and the musical conversations inaugurated by Kwaito in Southern Africa, and you know I know that this question now becomes impossibly huge, and with regard to Afro-diasporic space.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I was trying to get at was that I felt like there was a political language that had been developed within Kwaito, but that political language, and I was interested in that because I felt like it wasn't necessarily about the state, right? It wasn't necessarily about elections and certain kinds of forms of participatory democracy. And so I saw, you know, and yet, of course, never fully divorced, you know, from those things, right? So I saw, you know, so I used that quote to kind of get at, you know, the quote kind of to get at like, how can we think about what would be quote unquote political about these things that I'm about to talk about, whether it be consumption practices or gendered practices, et cetera. That being said, though, I mean, I think that the interesting thing about Kwaito was always, I think, at least in its initial engagement, I think this became less important by the late 90s, but in the initial engagement was all this tension and kind of hand-wringing around like how South African was it, right? I think because it was so almost promiscuous, right? And it's sort of borrowing from Black popular culture and Black popular music all around the world, which I try to make the claim that this isn't anything new. I didn't understand why people were kind of clutching their pearls, you know? You know, it wasn't anything new. I mean, you know, jazz, you know, Marabi, you know, there were all of these kinds of, you know, previous, you know, popular musics in in South Africa that you could code to certain kinds of global forms or Afro-diasporic forms of Black music. So I didn't really understand why that was so mobilized, you know, against Kwaito, and we had to kind of constantly check, you know, just how South African it was. I mean, I think at some point, because I think it was so uniquely South African in a particular kind of way, which doesn't mean it didn't circulate, I'll get to that. But because it was so uniquely South African in particular kinds of ways, I think that, you know, it wasn't anything that you would necessarily get going to any country, you know, any other country on the continent, unless, you know, it was kind of in the orbit of South Africa. So of course there was, you know, and I think Gavin Steingo talks a bit about this in his book on Kwaito, but, you know, there was Kwaito in Namibia, you know, all of the sort of neighboring countries, Lesotho, Botswana in particular, less so in Zim and Mozambique. And I think that's just because their musical cultures are maybe less are both in and not in the orbit of South Africa in particular kinds of ways. I think Zim, you get a lot more Congolese and Central African influenced pop music, right? Along with whatever, you know, the things they were doing in Zim, right? So, you know, you'd hear Kwaito and Zim, but I don't think you had a ton of, you know, a ton of like, producers and artists that were kind of in the genre. So it would circulate often because South Africa would circulate, right? Like, much like, and I don't want to, I also think the importance of Britain and kind of the UK Black scene in the 80s was really important for Kwaito, right? That's really, to me, the genesis of a lot of the dance hall that got into Kwaito. And so I think that as far as the rest of Africa was concerned, not a lot, maybe a bit more in East Africa, but not a lot of circulation until more recently, right? So you have, I'm thinking here now of a group like Mafiki Zola, which of course is kind of been all over the place, right? As far as sonically is concerned, right? I mean, I think there was probably a point in which, one could really question whether they were doing Kwaito at all, right? But they've really become kind of this more Pan-African group in their more recent incarnation, right? And to that extent, like people are listening to them, in West Africa and trying to figure out what are the Zulu lyrics and all of that kind of stuff. So, and I think some of that is because the kind of housey sound that Mafiki Zolo has kind of brought back into their more recent work, is layered a little bit with this sort of West African, Afrobeatsy, type thing. So I think it's allowed it to kind of circulate a little bit more universally. So now you're getting these interesting collaborations, for example, between Afrobeat artists and South African house, Gqom, type artists. I mean, one of the more interesting artists is someone in Gqom. I like her. I mean, I think a lot of the attention she gets is also because she's very conventionally attractive and lighter skinned and all of those things. But and why can I not remember her name right now? But she did the song Huku, which was in Swahili. And so she's doing some interesting things around language and bringing in different kinds of sounds, but then being really rooted in her Tsonga, or otherwise known as Shangaan culture, Shoma Jodzi, right? And then she got some shine because she was on Ellen, I think, and was part of the Black Panther soundtrack and so forth. So, I mean, those kinds of, so I mean, I think that contemporarily, like now, engagements of like people in the diaspora with Kwaito is definitely through that kind of the Gqom music and the house music and the Black Panther soundtrack that had a few, South African artists on there and so forth. Earlier on, I think that because house music is so much more underground, and I huge, giant scare quotes, as I say that in the United States, right? It didn't allow, I think Kwaito in its sort of earlier, people didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't quite hip hop. It wasn't quite house, right? And so it was hard to kind of, I think, market it in a particular, and it could not be marketed as world music, right? So it was really hard to kind of market it, in the kind of US culture outside of the club scene. Like people who were in the club scene would of course hear various different Kwaito artists, right? Whereas in Europe, because there is a much larger kind of electronic and house scene, a lot of people were able to kind of spread their music and engage with various different kind of musical cultures of Black youth that they were finding in those spaces, whether that be the UK, or France, or Germany, or Amsterdam, or the Netherlands, which would be kind of the primary places where these artists would play and their music would circulate. So.
Thank you. That's hugely helpful, because I felt like in reading the introduction, the part of the story that I was missing was the extent to which Kwaito was tethered to South African identity. And so just now, when you described it as so uniquely South African, that's really super helpful to me. I get it much better now. Thank you.
Thanks. Just to follow up on that, we had a question from Garnett Cadigan that was specifically about the reception and interaction in Europe with Kwaito. So that follows directly. Garnett? She's here?
Yeah, I'm here. Sure. Thanks so much, Xavier. And I loved what I read from the book so far. So the thing I was curious about, just hearing you speak already, is thinking about the kind of reconfigurations of Kwaito, almost like that second wave, the post-90s wave that happened, when it started being, recircuited back through a different part of Europe, particularly, with Berlin. This is Berlin and Spain. And so think of people like Uskidu, Professor, Candy. But the way it was also reconfigured as in a very bodily fashion, because by then there's still a kind of segmentation that happened in Joburg where people are saying, oh, Kwaito was, it's a kind of old music. We've gone past that. It was a 90s moment. We've moved on. But then suddenly, with this kind of combination with, particular house scenes in Berlin, it had a different, in like a new wave, in a new crest that came in the 2000s, like around 2012, and still going onwards. But a lot of it also very bodily. So all the videos, are very much about Kwaito, the deeper physical and dynamical physical thing. So think of like Uskidu with school children, or there's a next, almost like a sub branch of Kwaito. It's just in a queer body music, or women's music, or older folks music. And so I just wanted just to hear your own thoughts, and just for you to illuminate some of that with us about the ways in which that new European connection and almost like a next wave of Kwaito coming, and very bodily responses to it and shaping it. What do you think of it, and what might we learn about it from that?
I mean, I think that, so I will confess, right, that I don't know as much particularly about the kind of more recent, like let's just call it post aughts, kind of European engagements, right? But I'll speculate a bit, right? And so, yeah, I think that Kwaito was always this thing. I'll start by just saying that, as I was saying, I'm not as familiar, but I do think that there's always been this back and forth, right? In ways that Kwaito artists were vibing off of the European dance scene, right? And incorporating aspects of that into their practice, right? Of whether it was South African house practice or a more explicitly Kwaito practice. And I agree with you. I think that it has created these, I think in earlier Kwaito, the embodiments were maybe just more around what the fans were doing, right? But I think now, we are seeing like, I'm thinking about there's really like now a sort of active, like kind of queer Kwaito, or at least they sort of are making claims about engaging Kwaito, even if they'll say, they might use the word like Kwaito-ish or whatever, kind of artists that are, really making music explicitly for that scene. If people outside the queer community are interested in it, fine, right? But there isn't necessarily this desire for a certain kind of mainstream play and interest. And I think some of that has been influenced by some of that back and forth, right, of kind of global house/global dance music scenes that that a lot of these contemporary artists, or even artists who've been around for a while but have morphed, like Uskido, for example, in different ways, are participating in. So.
And then we have, I think, one last question from Azimuth, if you want to step up. Maybe he's there.
Thanks, Xavier.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe he's departed.
Yeah. I see the question. So I will just try to answer it very briefly. Yeah, so look, I think that I want to be clear that I don't want to present, Kwaito as a place that was, or as a cultural scene that was in and of itself a queer scene, right? But I do want to talk about the ways that I felt that queer people use some of the flexibility, right? And I think, you know, to be able to carve out different kinds of spaces in Kwaito, right? And so I think to that extent, you know, there were spaces for different kinds of transgression of, particularly, I think, around gender normativity, in the sense of like, what is this sort of appropriate behavior, you know, publicly, of a young Black woman in public space, right? And I think just contravening some of that, right, was really central to Kwaito. But it was also this place where, you know, I think it was it was also in oftentimes marginalized, or certainly not celebrated space. So in its kind of contravention, I would argue, of certain things, in its marginalization, it was able to kind of, I think, provide space for other folks that were kind of on the margins, whether they were on the margins because of just, you know, disrespectable forms of heterosexuality, or crossing certain kinds of gender norms or aged norms, or in some cases more explicitly, you know, actual like gender and sexuality norms and dichotomies, right? It provided a bit of a space to be able to explore that. And that's not to say that that was always smooth. That's not to say that there weren't moments where gender-based violence or forms of you know, certain kinds of queer baiting and bashing might not have occurred. Like, I don't want to make that seem to be the case. But I do want to say that at the same time, you know, there were clearly ways that people who were queer were able to participate in that scene and engage it and own it, and be a part of it. And I think that's part of what I explore more fully in the book, right, in some of the later chapters. So you know, I stopped short of querying, right, Kwaito, but I do think that there was a space for certain kinds of gender and sexuality non-normativity that I think oftentimes gets connected with these, you know, with sort of, you know, cultures that are a bit in the night space, a bit, you know, a bit disreputable anyway, right? You know, and actually I wanted to get back to something really quickly that that Marzia said in the first question, or that I just wanted to also, I'd meant to mention it really briefly, because I think I was asked about whether I think this could be applied to more contemporary forms of South African popular music, some of the theoretical frameworks that I came up with. Absolutely, and it's one of my pushing of the whole Afro-diasporic space concept really was about hoping that people would think about these things in relations to, you know, contemporary Black popular music that they may be more familiar with, whether that be hip hop, you know, whether that be, you know, grime in the UK or something like that. Like, I feel like these theoretical frameworks could, I'm not saying just be lifted wholesale and plopped, right? But could inform the way that people go about looking at, I think, various different forms of global Black popular musics and cultures. And I definitely intended it to kind of inform the way that one would look at South African popular musics and cultures. And I'll just say that I do think that in relation to house and Kwaito both, right, I played some examples of very wordy Kwaito, but in general, there weren't a lot of lyrics in a lot of these Kwaito songs, right? And then to that extent, that I think that's going back to its, you know, relationship to house being sort of more sonic and musically produced. Although, of course, we know there's vocal house. I'm not dismissing that. But I think that, you know, I think people wanted to, in the 90s, I think we're so used to when they were doing music criticism and scholarship, they wanted lyrics, right? I think that's why there was so much being written about hip hop, you know, because lyrics somehow connoted seriousness or politicism in particular kinds of ways. And I think that when when the music is more embodied, when it is more, I think, either implicitly or explicitly linked to queerness, to the femme, right? I think people have a harder, time sometimes like dealing with it and thinking about it in its complexity. It's already dismissed, right, as not being as serious. And so I think we should think about that, like when we're thinking about like why, music criticism and scholarship on electronic dance music. So I'm just using that as a very broad term to encompass a whole set of such said musics, right? Oftentimes, doesn't get the same kind of shine as our discussion of rock or hip hop or whatever, right? And so I hope that, some of the things that I've imagined theoretically would be found to be useful for people who are working in either similar kind of socio-political scenes or similar, kind of socio-cultural scenes. So, yeah.
Xavier, thank you so much.